Okay, so we're just about to go live.
Do you want me to wait 30 seconds or just start when they join?
Let's wait 30 seconds.
Excellencies, colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Tori Holt. I'm a director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth and a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. But for today, more importantly, I'm honored to moderate this discussion on the potential role of renewable energy with UN peacekeeping, particularly in South Sudan for the mission UNMISS, and more broadly in that country. Today's event brings together a group of partners, including Norway, the United Arab Emirates, Energy Peace Partners, and Stimson, who have supported a series of discussions on increasing the use of renewable energy in peacekeeping to improve the mission security, reduce costs, and promote a positive legacy for host communities and countries. Over the last 2.5 years, we've seen significant progress. We will hear about this today. The UN is prioritizing both more effective and efficient missions, as well as the increased use of renewable energy as part of its environmental and climate goals. As many of you know, this is part of meeting the Secretary General's aim of being 80% renewable energy usage by 2030 and meeting the UN Secretariat Climate Action Plan UNSCAP. In January, many of us went to Abu Dhabi for the IRENA General Assembly Ministerial on the UN's Energy Compact on renewable energy and peacekeeping. That was a high-level event, I think the first of its kind, to really bring together senior leaders from the UN, peacekeeping, member states, private sector, NGO, international development, and government officials, including those in countries where UN missions operate. So now to our subject. Since 2021, these discussions and the Powering Peace reports have looked at the pathways forward for an energy transition. The most recent one on Somalia and the UN mission UNSOS highlighted a groundbreaking solar project in Baldoa using a private-public partnership where the mission, as a large stable customer, served as the anchor client to attract private finance to build a solar project that will power both the UN and the local community. I mention this because this is a model that's now being tested in South Sudan and with the UN mission UNMISS. So we'll hear about what's happening in South Sudan today, a country which I think is the least electrified in the world, where less than 7.5% of its population has access to electricity. Extending that electrification outside of the capital, Juba, and throughout the country is one of the goals, but depends on hard and long supply chains, is expensive, and will require the efforts not just of UNMISS, but its partners. So this report also comes on the heels of the Security Council adding language to the recent mandate for UNMISS, the fourth we understand the Council's done, talking about the benefits of renewable energy and the positive legacy. So let me turn first to the order of today. In a moment, I'll turn to my colleagues to open the conversation from the UAE, Norway, and the UN and the Department of Operational Support. Next, we'll have the authors of the most recent report speak to its findings and where they recommend we go next. Report's called Renewable Energy and the United Nations, a Green Spark for Peace in South Sudan. And then we'll involve the key stakeholders, our colleagues both from UNMISS itself, as well as the Undersecretary of Environment in the South Sudan Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and a colleague from the World Bank. And then we'll close out with hopefully an exciting and interesting back and forth conversation. So without further ado, let me turn to my colleague, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the UAE to the UN, Amira Al-Hafiti, to open up the conversation. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. Good morning, colleagues. It's an honor to host you at this webinar co-organized by the UAE, Norway, and Powering Peace, a joint initiative of Energy Peace Partners and the Stimson Center. Many of you that may have participated in previous iterations of this webinar might know that since 2021, this is the fourth such event that we are organizing with our partners. Through these events, our intention is to shine light on best practices and potential scenarios for peacekeeping missions efforts to increase their share of renewable energy use. The discussions are framed around the UN's 80% renewable energy target by 2030, as well as around the positive byproducts of such a shift, including a reduction in peacekeeping costs, security risks, and greenhouse gas emissions, all the while providing lasting legacies for host communities in the form of energy infrastructure. In our previous discussions, we have focused, as you mentioned, Victoria, we focused on renewable energy use in MINUSMA in Mali and UNISOM in Somalia. Today, our focus is on South Sudan. The UN mission in South Sudan, as most of you know, is one of the largest peacekeeping missions in the world. And its efforts to transition to renewable energy represent a real opportunity for electrification of the country that is among the least electrified in the world. We are pleased that in recognition of this potential within the latest mandate renewal of UNMISS, Security Council members agreed to reference the environmental strategy of UN's Department of Operational Support and the need to shift to increased use of renewables. I will let the authors of the report and our other panelists with us today address the issue of energy use within UNMISS. But let me say a few words on the Renewable Energy Compact for Peacekeeping and the UAE's upcoming presidency of COP28. As many of you might know, earlier this year in January 2023, the Energy Compact on Renewable Energy for UN Peacekeeping was formally launched in Abu Dhabi in conjunction with the 13th Assembly of IRENA. The objective of the compact, in addition to what Victoria mentioned, is to help accelerate the implementation of the UN's renewable energy target. The event held in January had brought together host governments of peacekeeping missions, the UN leadership of PKOs, as well as the private sector and other relevant stakeholders in an unprecedented way to discuss potential joint areas for action. As a result of the event, a joint communique was adopted with actionable steps, including support for knowledge exchange, technical assistance, and capacity building to support interested host governments to promote project development and facilitate financing. In addition, IRENA and the UN's Department of Operational Support were called upon to establish a secretariat to guide and coordinate the work of the Energy Compact in facilitating this shift to renewables. We hope that in the near future, more countries will join the compact and our collective efforts to see the UN lead by example in climate action. And in closing, let me tie this all back to COP28, which will be held in the UAE in November of this year. Our president-designate for COP28, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, and his engagement across the world has been clear. We need to shift from incremental steps to transformational progress across mitigation, adaptation, finance, and loss and damage. On mitigation in particular, COP28 will have to demonstrate concrete ambition and actions to close the gap to 1.5C. This will necessitate a commitment to scale up renewable energy capacity by tripling renewable energy investment and improving storage. This is a massive undertaking, but if the scale and speed of action on renewables in the past years is anything to go by, we have hope for optimism. We look forward to our fruitful discussion today, and thank you all for being with us. Back to you, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Amira, and for encouraging us to think about this massive undertaking. Very inspiring. Let me turn next to our co-host, Hans Olav Ibrecht, who is Norway's Special Envoy for Climate and Security. Hans Olaf, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. And first, thanks to you, Tori and Amira, for setting the stage for our discussion. I think you've already brought up many of the points that I would like to make, but let me also say that it was really great to see all of you, or at least many of you, in Abu Dhabi in January when we launched Renewable Energy and Peacekeeping Compact. And I think it was a really well-attended event, and it was a great success to our partnership. Power from small energy service providers that rely on hazardous and polluting diesel generators. As already been mentioned, UNMISS is one of the largest UN peacekeeping missions, and it's almost entirely dependent on diesel generators for power. And a really interesting aspect of this report that I would really encourage all of you to take a close look at is that the report clearly shows the political economy of diesel and how the diesel economy aggravates drivers of conflict. Norway welcomes the report by the Powering Peace Initiative and the clear recommendations that they provide to the UN and to development partners, how this can then provide a green spark for peace in South Sudan through renewable energy. As already been highlighted, in moving forward, the cooperation with private sector, both domestic and, let me also underscore, domestic private sector and not only international, will be essential. The report states clearly that engaging private sector through PPAs or power purchasing agreements is the only realistic option in many of these settings, and I support this finding. This will admittedly not be an easy task, but we've already seen promising examples with cooperation between the private sector and the UN, for instance, in Somalia, as also was described by Tori. So it's important to consider that South Sudan and the case that we are discussing today is not unique. Up to 2/3 of the world's extreme poor will live in conflict-affected situation by 2030, according to the World Bank. And in conflict-affected countries where access to resources is limited, we need to explore ways in which we can leave a positive legacy through energy infrastructure investments. So cooperation between the UN, host governments, local communities, and private sectors will offer an interesting possibility to achieve several objectives at the same time. A renewable transition will improve the mission's environmental footprint, provide economic savings over time, and reduce convoy-related security requirements. And it can also support the local energy sector and create new peace dividends across the country. Let me again thank the UAE, the Powering Peace Initiative, and DOS for the excellent cooperation that we've had in moving this agenda forward. As already has been mentioned, that through our joint efforts, we have now ensured that 4 UN peacekeeping missions have received a mandate from the UN Security Council to increase the use of renewable energy. And I'm really looking forward to helping UAE and other members of the Security Council to move this agenda even further. I also note that the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations has also made specific recommendations to this effect as well. And of course, now we all have to deliver, and UNMISS has to deliver in particular on this mandate. And I'm looking forward to hear more how this mandate will be implemented and also how this can provide highly needed energy services to the people of South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hans Olaf, for your leadership and your easy way of knitting together so many of the aspirations that we hope turn to reality. Let me turn next to Elizabeth Rolando, who is the Chief of Office of the UN Undersecretary General for Operational Support, and really at the heart of a lot of this work. Elizabeth, may I turn the floor to you?
Thank you very much, Tori. I'm delighted to be here today on behalf of Undersecretary General Kare, who has for a long time put environment at the center of what we do. I'd like to thank the organizers and hosts of this important discussion, the Permanent Mission of UAE and the envoy of Norway. I'm also grateful to Powering Peace for continuing to do such interesting and important work. And particularly happy to be joined in this meeting by the representative of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry for South Sudan, by colleagues from the World Bank, and my colleague from UNMISS, who I don't see on the screen, but I think is here, DSRG Song. Accelerating the transition of field missions to renewable energy is one of the strategic areas for the second phase of the UN Secretariat's environment strategy for peace operations, which I was very pleased to hear mentioned. We have made modest progress so far. The share of electricity we get from renewable sources is currently about 6% globally and 2% in the case of UNMISS. We are seeking to accelerate this transition using three main approaches: building solar photovoltaic systems inside UN camps, through UN-owned equipment, or through solar PV systems deployed by our troops and police contributing countries. We are also seeking to connect to local grids that have a share of renewable energy where this is possible. Largely, this has been successful in MONUSCO, Democratic Republic of Congo. And we are looking to outsource electricity supply to renewable energy producers, including private power producers or local utilities. So far, we have built solar PV systems in over 90 operational sites across peacekeeping. While some level of on-site renewable power generation is appropriate in missions, it's unfortunately not possible to fully transition to renewable energy in this way because the cost is prohibitive. The other thing, of course, is, and I will mention this in greater detail in a moment, we're also interested in leaving a positive legacy to the host communities. Connecting to local grids makes sense, but this option, as I mentioned, is only available in a few locations. And I mentioned the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has a great deal of hydropower, and the other one is Cyprus. Consequently, we see outsourcing energy supply as a transformative approach, which could not only significantly accelerate our transition to renewable energy, but also leave a positive legacy in the host community, which is a strong priority for us. We believe that the high energy demand and the high creditworthiness of peace operations can attract local and international investments that can ensure the bankability of projects and lead to local job creation. So a strategy oriented towards outsourcing energy can support the sustainability of renewable energy systems past the mission's lifetime and contribute to the long-term involvement of the energy sector in host countries. The Energy Compact for Renewable Energy and Peacekeeping, which was launched in Abu Dhabi in January by UAE and Norway, is an absolutely excellent vehicle for building partnerships that will accelerate our transition to renewables. And this, we'll be able to do this through this through this mechanism, while contributing to improving access to renewable energy in our host communities. So it meets all of our requirements. We have made progress since the high-level meeting on the compact that took place in Abu Dhabi, primarily in greater engagement between missions, the host governments, and the World Bank. Abu Dhabi really got the conversation going in a way that was absolutely needed in order to develop the projects that missions had been considering. And we are exploring these options very carefully and hope that the next time we have a chance to gather in one of these settings, we would actually be able to give you details of specific progress on these projects. We greatly appreciate the work that Powering Peace has been doing to support missions in broadening their horizons to increase the renewable energy share. And also in linking these efforts to the host country's electrification plans. So we very much look forward to hearing from the drafters of this excellent report and to engaging in the conversation today. And thank you for making this possible. Back to you, Tori.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and real kudos to you, all your colleagues within your offices at the UN. It's been a tough road, but you've made it look easy. So thank you for that work. It's a pleasure. All right, so we'll now get to this report, A Green Spark for Peace in South Sudan. I think it's been mentioned, but the mission itself accounts for almost 20% of the total energy consumption in the country and is related to political economy. So I'll introduce all three speakers and then call on them separately. The two main authors, the two lead authors of this report are first Flora Macron, a visiting fellow at LSE's Feroz Lajij Institute for Africa, and co-author Eugene Chen, who is the director of the Prevention and Peacebuilding Program at NYU Center on International Cooperation. And then they will be joined by Energy Peace Partners founder, President David Mozersky, who is a contributing author. But please, Flora, over to you.
And nice to see you, and hopefully it'll be fine. Just I'm in Kenya right now, and I've had a couple of this evening, so if it goes dark, that will be. So written released quite a which is included.
Flora, we are having a very hard time hearing you. I don't know if it's an adjustment. We should go to Eugene first, or do you want to try again? All right.
Okay, is that any better?
Yes, that's totally better. We can hear you.
Okay, might have been my AirPods. Okay, so yeah, we've only got a few minutes today, and there's quite a long, comprehensive report which covers kind of research and data collection from several locations around the country. So unfortunately, I won't be able to walk you through all of it today, but I just wanted to kind of focus on the sort of key central story here, which is the role of the electricity sector in South Sudan's conflict dynamics. So I think it's sort of well known and much discussed that South Sudan is an oil producing country, and that there's been a lot of discussion about the relationship between its oil production and revenue and the conflict dynamics. But meanwhile, the role of the electricity sector as a sort of kind of related component of this has really been discussed very little, but it's actually a really, I would argue, a key piece of the puzzle. So as has kind of been mentioned already this evening, South Sudan's electricity is very limited. We're looking at probably just over 7% of the country with access to electricity, although even to kind of come up with those numbers is really difficult. And that comes almost exclusively from diesel-powered generators. Sorry, just to interrupt. Can you still hear me? Oh, you can. Okay, great. Comes from diesel-powered generators. There are a few exceptions, which I'm sure we'll discuss at some point in terms of solar infrastructure, but mainly, yeah, it's all diesel-powered generators that the limited supply of electricity comes from. And at a basic level, what that looks like is a grid in Juba, which has operated very intermittently over the years and charges very, very high tariffs for consumers. I think it's functional at the moment, but it hasn't been for kind of large chunks of time in the recent past. And then there are a sort of handful of other kind of grids in some of the state capital towns around the country, these are also in varying degrees of functionality. Many of which are not functional, especially in the wake of the sort of 2013 conflict. And then you have a sort of innumerable number of small generators for individual households and businesses around the rest of the country. And all of the diesel that is used in these generators is imported. South Sudan does obviously produce oil, but it doesn't have the facilities at the moment to refine its oil into diesel. It's in the process, I gather, of constructing some refineries, including one in Bentiu, but these are not finalized yet. And actually, my understanding is that even once those diesel refineries are kind of producing, the cost of the diesel would probably be very high and maybe not competitive in comparison to imported diesel. So mostly what we see is that the diesel that kind of reaches South Sudan is shipped from the Middle East to the port in Mombasa, and then it is trucked up through East Africa to South Sudan's Nimali border in the south. And when it reaches that point, that's where it's supposed to be kind of declared and taxed, and then transported throughout the country by road and by river barge. But what we see is that even at the earliest stages, kind of problems start to emerge. And these range from reports of large-scale corruption scandals associated with awarding oil import contracts, to more localized corruption associated with kind of border authorities, or the diversion of diesel that's coming into the country, or its contamination with other substances. And then after that, once it's entered the country, it's then moved around by a sort of very decentralized, informal private sector of energy companies, probably at least 60 in the country, nobody really knows. And they kind of transport and trade it around the country. And then what we see is that as it moves up to Juba and then beyond, it is kind of taxed or diverted at dozens and dozens more checkpoints along the kind of key road transport routes, and then also the river transport routes around the country. Some of these checkpoints are kind of formal and they're legal and legitimate and they are collecting proper taxes, but many more, I would say, are informal, often manned by kind of armed actors associated with the country's multitude of warring factions, or they're kind of more criminal banditry type groups or other sort of illegal networks, I guess you'd say, or informal at least. And as a result, what we see is that kind of quite simply, like the volume of fuel that reaches Juba and reaches the other state capitals and then the country's more peripheral areas, the volume of diesel dwindles, and then the price of it escalates hugely, and these prices also fluctuate massively kind of week to week. And certainly in the last year or so, we've seen a huge increase because of the war in Ukraine, as well as more localized issues. And then also what we see at the same time, because of all these armed checkpoints, is that the security risks and the threats associated with kind of transporters, traders, and consumers of the diesel are really high, especially in certain parts of the country. And so in this way, you kind of see this particular status quo being perpetuated, which is that, you know, we have this multitude of armed factions and armed actors and kind of groupings around the country, quite a high degree of criminality, chronic insecurity, and militarization of communities, and that the diesel transport process is one of several things which kind of funds and perpetuates this particular status quo around the country. I should say, you know, lots of other goods are also taxed at these checkpoints as they move around the country, including kind of food and other sort of agricultural goods, but diesel seems to be one of the most highly taxed and highly diverted because it's very high value. And then, if we look to sort of specific locations around the country, because we did some data collection in a number of kind of case study areas, including places where UNMISS has a footprint or a kind of major operation. So when we look at places like Bentiu or Malakal, kind of further north, which are places that have suffered some of the worst violence of the war and have been very badly affected by kind of environmental shocks and damage, including severe flooding and then kind of conflict-related environmental destruction. And these places also have huge IDP populations, including in kind of former POC sites. So in these places, the prices for powering small generators for local businesses, as well as the kind of power stations in the local towns, and then any kind of public services, including hospitals, schools, government buildings, military buildings, all of that, it's just astronomically high. So it's so incredibly expensive to put diesel in your small generator or your large generator. And this affects these areas in all sorts of ways, but kind of put simply, what it means is that for these kind of towns and these areas in some of these parts of the country that have been really severely affected by conflict, their ability to recover and regenerate, to kickstart or sort of build up the local economy, to develop public services, and just for communities to kind of just get on with their lives, both IDP communities and locals, is just hugely impeded because they can't really generate electricity, and where they can, it causes a lot of insecurity and it's just massively expensive. So even though we see, a massive reduction or absence of armed conflict in some of these areas, it's sort of like, it's like the people are still kind of stuck in this limbo of not being able to move forward because electricity is just so very, very hard to access and to maintain in any kind of consistent way.
Thank you, Flora. That is fantastic. Could I ask you to maybe wrap up?
Yeah, sorry, that was me. I was just about to finish. Yeah, so that's kind of the situation. And then into that, I'll let Eugene and my other colleagues kind of explain then what the role of the UN kind of currently is, and I guess could be, and other partners.
Wonderful, thank you. Eugene Chen, I'd love to turn the floor to you.
Thanks so much, Tori. And we've just heard from Flora, who's kind of presented us an overview of the picture in South Sudan as a whole. I'm now going to actually just drill down into and focus on the activities of the UN itself, and particularly the UN mission in South Sudan. UNMISS has over 17,000 personnel in South Sudan, representing well over 90% of all UN personnel in the country. Its footprint includes, several compounds in Juba, 9 field offices outside of Juba, team sites in Pibor and Ye, as well as some additional kind of military bases, 6 company-level operating bases, and between 3 and 6 temporary operating bases at any given time. With such a large footprint, obviously, comes large electricity demands. UN peace operations continue to rely heavily on diesel generators for their electricity requirements, and UNMISS is certainly no exception. The bulk of UNMISS requirements are currently met through a combination of UN-owned and contingent-owned diesel generators. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the contingent-owned equipment, or COE system, the UN provides reimbursement to troop and police contributing countries for major equipment and logistical capabilities deployed under an agreement signed between the country and the UN. Reimbursement is payable to the troop or police contributing countries if equipment is found to be serviceable during quarterly inspections, and supply of fuel to military and police contingents is the responsibility of the UN. Diesel generators represent 55% of the total fuel consumption in UNMISS. This, however, doesn't actually capture the totality of electricity-related fuel consumption, because fuel is also required for the transport of diesel to UNMISS locations outside of Juba. This includes barge and road convoys, which will oftentimes require a considerable military escort, but also smaller and more remote locations rely on diesel that is flown by UNMISS aircraft. As Elizabeth mentioned earlier, the actual proportion of UNMISS requirements that are met by renewable energy, in this case, solar power, is still in the single digits. Although the mission has been making steady progress over the last few financial periods in increasing the amount of renewables that are present within the country or for the mission, at this rate of growth, there's no way that the mission is on track to meet its targets under the UN Secretariat Climate Action Plan, including the 40% target by 2024 and the 80% target of renewables by 2030. In the larger UNMISS locations, the bulk of electricity requirements are covered by UN-owned equipment, and in many of these places, the existing UN-owned equipment power plants actually do have the capacity to meet the entirety of requirements, including for military and police, but would require some infrastructure upgrades. As in other peacekeeping missions, the contingent-owned equipment generators are by and large of poor quality and poorly maintained. This is something that has been reported to member states in numerous audits and have been confirmed by UNMISS staff who we interviewed for this particular report. There are three kind of key findings with regards to the existing contingent equipment, which are that the contingents currently deploy far more generators than are operationally required. The generators are oftentimes not synchronized and run at very low load, which is inefficient and also increases the likelihood of maintenance problems. And also, most of the COE generators don't have any meters, so it's actually difficult to accurately measure fuel consumption and output. Even though the contingent owned equipment system has included the possibility of reimbursement for renewables and hybrids since 2017, there's been very little uptake because the COE system is designed to reimburse what TCCs and troop and police contributing countries have in their inventories and not to actually finance procurement of new equipment. As such, the first step in rationalizing electricity generation in peacekeeping missions such as UNMISS is to really shift the responsibility where possible to the mission support component away from the contingents. Contingents can still deploy generators and be reimbursed for them, but these should be understood to be available primarily as backup or for use when UN-owned equipment is not available, such as when military components are deployed to the temporary operating bases. This would help reduce fuel consumption across the mission. Now, when it comes to renewable energy itself, UN-owned equipment solar projects can help make progress, but as we've seen, it's not really enough to significantly shift the needle. The key obstacles to greater renewables include lack of expertise. Like most UN staff in procurement and engineering who work on electricity issues are primarily familiar with diesel and not renewable energy. In addition, there's entrenched policies, practices, and mindsets within peacekeeping that treat diesel as the default. Also getting the committees like the Fifth Committee, the Budget Committee of the General Assembly to embrace renewable energy in the past has also been a challenge as cost savings over diesel oftentimes take longer to materialize. And so the only viable solution, as has been mentioned before, in the short term may be for the UN to turn to outside providers and rely on power purchase agreements in some of the largest field locations. In South Sudan, UNMISS is working on a power purchase agreement in Malakal, through which it will pay for electricity from a new renewable energy provider. Such agreements really provide the potential for allowing the UN to shift a significant amount of its electricity generation to renewable sources within the existing framework of the UN regulations and rules. In such models, the UN serves as an anchor client that can provide sufficient guaranteed demand for long enough time to make development of a new solar plant economically viable for third-party providers. I'll just wrap up by saying that member states should really support the Secretary in its efforts in this regard, as power purchase agreements can help the UN reduce its carbon footprint and really be able to walk the talk on climate action. They can also be much less expensive than the current reliance on generators, particularly when the total costs of diesel, transport, maintenance, disposal, and associated opportunity costs are really factored in. Also, the shift to renewables doesn't actually really affect the existing reimbursement framework because TCCs will continue to be able to deploy and be reimbursed for contingent owned equipment generators. But it'll just need to be understood that these generators will primarily be set aside for backup in sector headquarters and main field sites rather than be used actively for electricity generation. And this shift can all be done within existing rules, regulations, and procedures. They just really require political will. I'll stop there, but before giving the floor, I just wanted to thank all the UN staff who supported this project and who are working tirelessly to move this agenda forward at headquarters and in the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eugene. And your ability to explain a complicated system is very impressive and appreciated. Dave Mazursky, any final thoughts on this combination before we turn to a broader discussions?
And today's discussion of South Sudan is particularly important because the situation is as clear and acute as any we've seen in the cases we've looked at. As we've heard, the reality of South Sudan's electricity sector is abysmal, with very little investment happening in the sector outside of Juba. So it's against this backdrop that we must assess the role of UNMISS, the largest energy consumer in the country. UNMISS's efforts to transition to renewable energy and its willingness to act as an anchor client to bring new projects to life in places like Malakal become all the more important in this context. It's no exaggeration to say that UNMISS represents the single best opportunity to bring new electricity projects to South Sudan, particularly outside of Juba. It's the largest energy consumer, it's creditworthy, it has large footprints. UNMISS should be encouraged to expand new renewable energy projects for its sites across South Sudan. In addition, these projects, wherever possible, should also benefit local communities and extend new energy access. It's within the realm of the possible to imagine an UNMISS-led renewable energy transition as the catalyst for new clean energy mini-grids across South Sudan. Without this catalyst from UNMISS, the status quo will likely remain unchanged. The new solar project that UNMISS is working towards in Malakal is a positive development. It's the second power purchase agreement type project that a UN peacekeeping mission has pursued, and the first time it's initiated the process for engaging the private sector on this type of project. It's an approach we've encouraged, and it's a model that UN peacekeeping is excited about and championing and hoping to replicate in other missions and sites. However, what we are learning from these early examples, such as Malakal, is that UNMISS alone, UN peacekeeping alone, does not have the mandate or the financing to build out larger projects on its own that will power both the UN and the local communities from the outset. In practice, it's falling on the renewable energy project developers to figure out the local electrification or local benefit component of these projects. The Malakal solar project, as currently conceived, will likely be built only to power the UNMISS base at the beginning. It will likely not include power for Malakal town, a regional capital, which lies a few kilometers away from the UN base. Why is this happening? There's a mandate gap. UNMISS and UN peacekeeping are not in the local power supply business, but they are increasingly taking proactive steps to green their own power supplies. Therefore, this push needs to be supplemented by other partners to take advantage of the opportunities that these new projects will present. A new coalition is needed to create the wider framework to support and expand on these renewable energy projects anchored in UN peacekeeping sites. The coalition should include development partners like the World Bank, bilateral donors, member states, private sector partners, and the host government. The UN's purchasing power will see new projects built, but it will take other partners to supplement, support, and build on this if we're to take full advantage of the opportunities for local development benefits and peace dividends. Because while the focus of today's discussion is on South Sudan, there are equally compelling cases and arguments in other poorly electrified communities that host large peacekeeping operations in Somalia, Mali, DRC, and CAR. We're working on building this coalition of partners, hopefully to be launched at COP28, to help support a portfolio of win-win projects and achieve this vision. We hope you'll join us. Thank you, and back to you, Tori.
Thank you so much, Flora, Eugene, and Dave. It's a hard thing to basically summarize such an in-depth report. But I'm excited now to turn to the folks who are in South Sudan and thinking about its future. I'd like to turn next to Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General in UNMISS, Guang Kong. We've asked him ahead of time to think about a few questions, including based on what you've just heard and the idea of this model for cooperation, if the mission is also looking at other sites beyond Malakal, and what will determine if that works or not, and how feasible is it to think about the opportunities for further electrification and addressing some of the challenges and supporting some of the partnerships you just heard about. But sir, the floor is yours, Mr. SRSG, Deputy SRSG.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria, for the invitation. and also congratulations for the launching of this excellent report. And for South Sudan, everyone knows, is the least, one of the least electrified country in the world. But everyone must be also fully aware that South Sudan has huge potential to build the national renewable energy, because it has the abundant sources like this hydropower and the solar energy. To transition the UN peacekeeping mission to renewable energy is a very serious undertaking, which will not only help, to reduce the environmental footprint of the mission, but also is going to help to develop the local capacity of the local stakeholders, and also to benefit the local communities in general. So it is a win-win situation. For AMIS, we are fully committed to working closely with all the partners, including the host governments, UN country team, the private and the public partners, to achieve the ambitious targets as specified in our energy compact. For AMIS, we have already taken a number of the initiatives to translate our commitments to the very specific actions. And one is, as mentioned earlier by the previous speakers, that we are working on a power purchase agreement to meet up to 85% of energy requirements for our field office in Malacca. We are also working on the pilot projects to connect the missions compound in Tonping in Juba to a proposed composite energy grid by a local electricity company. In our headquarters in Juba, the water treatment plants and the pumping stations have been connected to the solar energy to reduce diesel-generated power consumption. We are also upgrading solar power storage systems in WAO and also UN House in Juba. We have plans for the next coming 3 budget cycles to upgrade and centralize the powerhouses, purchasing of efficient inverter-type AC systems, solar street lights, bathroom capsules with solar water heaters. However, to achieve these ambitious renewable energy targets by 2030, we still have a long way to go for the mission. The major challenges we're facing here, I would like to highlight a few. One is lack of the adequate local capacity, and another one is lack of the necessary funding. And then another one is the volatile subnational security environments. And then the weak governance structures at all levels in South Sudan, and also the annual renewal of mandates of the peacekeeping mission. Our mission is being renewed on an annual basis. So those are some of the challenges that the mission are facing at this stage. But having said that, I would like to call upon all partners, the private, the public, and the international organizations, as well as member states. Let us work together and to achieve this very important goal and target. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both for the fulsome details you've been able to provide, as well as your candor about some of the challenges and your call for partnership. I'm very pleased now to turn to the Undersecretary of Environment in the South Sudan Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Joseph Bartel, and to get his response to both this analysis and optimism and what he would recommend for a way forward. Over to you, sir.
Thank you once again. I'm really excited to be with you. It's now going to something to 6. Since morning I'm in the office, but because of the launch of this report and the discussions there, I think it's very important for us as government, because regardless of the mission being in South Sudan, as our strategy for fighting climate change, our nationally determined contribution, a country like ours, is to generate at least 3,000 megawatts of power from hydro, solar, wind, geothermal. But all the issues that we have at the moment, yes, we do have some private companies that are generating power. For example, in Juba, we have Israel, and they are generating 33 megawatts of power from generators, diesel generators. And as a government, we have asked them in order to increase that capacity using renewables. Now, I was at their plant 2 weeks ago, and they've already installed a plant for about a solar plant that will generate 26 megawatts of solar. And they have another land given to them that will be able to generate another 50 megawatts. So for the offices in Juba, for the UNMIS, I think they will be able to join the grid, connect to the grid, and that simply means the energy that is being produced will be a hybrid, but mostly 80% will be clean, and it will reduce their footprint. For Malakal, yes, the power purchase agreement, we are trying also to have some discussions and try to look into that. But mostly, the difficulty is that our private investors or companies do have is the issue of funding. So we'd like to see to it that bilateral donors and the World Bank should come in for us to be able to realize this project, regardless of UNMIS being here or not. I think it's the right trajectory that the country wants to embark on, and to cut its emissions. Because at the moment, the 7.2% figure that people have access to power is questionable. I think it's less than 1%, because 99.9% of our people depend on fuel wood as a source of energy, and it's causing a lot of pressure on our forest. So for us now to try to get the other sources of energy in order to reduce the pressure from our forest is the policy of the government. And we're looking forward to have the discussions with UNMIS and other partners to make sure that the country gets reliable, clean energy from the sources that we have. We have the Nile that can generate a lot of hydropower. And we also try to look into other countries to come and invest, because Norway had a project for 75 megawatts of power in Nimule, Fola Rapids. But because of the 2013 conflict, that project stopped. But now with the relative peace that we have, I think we as government are looking forward to welcome investors into the country and also partner with UNMIS to try to see to it that our population have the energy so that we transition from a least developed country at least to a middle income country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Undersecretary, and thank you for being more clear about the lack of energy access and your ambition to address that. It's extremely important and helpful. So now I would like to turn to Rutu Dave, who is a senior energy specialist at the World Bank and team leader on Leave No One Behind program. Not to pile on, but there's lots of ambitions for what the bank can do. So let me give you the floor. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm not sure. Can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome. Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to participate. The World Bank and its Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, SMAP, has been working for some time in providing energy access to host communities and displaced settlements, including in refugee camps. Last December, so December 2022, in Geneva at the UNHCR High Commissioner's Dialogue on Protection Challenges Development Cooperation, the World Bank launched its flagship report, Leaving No One Behind, Rethinking Energy Access Programs in the Context of Displacement. The dialogue in particular emphasized how energy access issues put a strain on local resources and the capacity and present political challenges for local governments. The report addresses the opportunities in particular for host communities, especially in rural and remote areas to benefit from access to safe, affordable, and reliable energy, as well as lessening and eliminating diesel generators for electricity to meet carbon reduction and renewable energy targets. Our work naturally complements the UN peacekeeping initiatives, and we do see a role for the bank to be a partner in supporting and leveraging the UN projects, in particular to support local electrification. The recent report on renewable energy and the United Nations provides more specific recommendations to UMIS, which not only concur, but are already being followed by the bank. We've had initial conversations and meetings with the UN peacekeeping forces to see how particularly we can support their plans. The World Bank's energy specialists are already working on the ground in with the government of South Sudan to see how energy can be extended there. And we look forward to working with government agencies and development partners as we consider plans for public and private sector investment in the renewable energy and the electricity sector, particularly in South Sudan. I think a point to note in particular here is that the differentiation between the World Bank and the UN in some of these cases is our budget cycle. The UN seems to have a yearly budget cycle while we work on multi-year cycles. So we hope that we can use this complementarity to achieve the goals. And in particular, I'd like to mention that we have a large project looking at energy access in South Sudan, in particular going to the World Bank board on the 25th of April. So I'm happy to share more details on this project and the specific nature of the work that we will be extending to the government of South Sudan after this project clears board on the 25th of April. But let me end by saying that we are very happy to be part of this conversation. We're very happy to be engaging already on the ground on actual specifics that we can cause to ensure that there is delivery of sustainable energy resources on the ground in South Sudan, both to the local population as well as to UN peacekeeping. Thank you for the opportunity to participate again, and we look forward to working with you.
Well, thank you so much, Rutu. I would like to invite people now to raise their hands or put a question into the Q&A function. And since I did not announce that earlier, I will briefly turn back to our World Bank colleague with a very simple question while we look for those who wish to intervene from the floor. I'll just ask you, Rutu, you mentioned the budget cycles. Can you say what practical effect there is if the UN mandates for a year and they're trying to expand access to energy and the bank doesn't think on a yearly cycle? Could you just tell our audience a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Thanks very much. But I think the UN colleagues would be better placed to talk about their budget cycle than me at the World Bank, to be very frank with you. But our loans that go out to countries are at a minimum for a minimum of 25 to 30 years. So there is an extended budget available for them to engage in resources. I would like to turn it over to whoever you think is most appropriate to talk about UN budget cycles from their side. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll briefly go to Eugene, who I think is still with us and who looked at this both through the lens of this report. I don't know also if Elizabeth Rolando is still on, but if either of you would like to mention why the budget cycle timing matters for expanding access to energy with the support of the UN mission, I'd love your brief thoughts on that.
Thanks, Tori. I mean, I can say a couple things, but I would be more comfortable if the actual current UN colleagues were to say more. But I mean, in general terms, UN peacekeeping does operate on a single-year budget cycle, and traditionally that has been challenging when it comes to implementation of projects that have large capital expenditures and where the kind of cost savings take longer to phase in, because the budget committees, including both the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly and the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions, they really focus on cost expenditures for the year coming up, and they oftentimes just compare them to the performance from previous years. So being able to only kind of look at costs in year by year makes it very difficult to really kind of appreciate longer term expenditures or savings over time and things like that. So that's traditionally been a challenge when it comes to consideration and approval of renewable energy projects. One of the challenges in that regard. Part of it is probably also a presentational issue. I think there's ways of improving how the UN actually presents its budgets and how it does cost-benefit analysis. And I think this is one of the challenges that, in fact, the UN is also currently working to address. Having more data about total cost of ownership and total cost of different alternatives also helps provide the tools to make a better case to the member states. And I know that the UN has been taking steps to kind of be able to obtain more data on fuel consumption, use, et cetera, to be able to help be able to put this type of case to the member states. But I'll stop here and see whether there's UN colleagues who would like to say more on this subject. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Eugene. And let me amend that question if others would like to weigh in. But I'd like to start. I'm turning now to some of the questions posed from our audience. So one is very practical, and I might turn to our colleagues, the Deputy SRSG or the Minister in South Sudan, about how to actually work practically if they are interested in working with if people from the private sector and CSOs want to partner with UNMISS. Is there a natural and easy way to do that? What would you advise? And I'm also happy for any of our other colleagues to jump in on this, but maybe the Deputy SRSG or the our Minister from South Sudan would like to speak to that.
Let me come in first before our Undersecretary from the Ministry of Environment to come in. From the UN perspective on this budget issue, I will say it is really, it's on an annual basis. That's why when we were preparing, our budgets, for the next budget cycle, we're happy to focus on this that particular the budget cycle, the achievements there. That's why there is a certain level of limitation when you're planning the long term. The investments, on that. Coming back to the collaboration with the TSO and the local stakeholders, for UNMISS, we are quite open. We engage with all partners, both public and private, to explore all avenues of cooperation. And, of course, our technical people from mission support, they would be leading this process. We have to follow the UN proper rules and the regulations when it's come to this kind of arrangements.
All right, well, thank you.
Back to you, please.
All right. Mr. Undersecretary, if you'd like to say anything to that point, I welcome your response.
Civil society and other NGOs, I think we are ready to have them in the country. So there are some procedures that they come in, they register their companies, we do the vetting, and after that they get no objection in order to operate. And that's something that we are looking forward to get more people to come into the country.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I have a question that actually Hans Olaf might be able to join us on, or any of the earlier speakers, which is some of this is about countries trying to meet their own climate ambitions. And while there are resources to support that in general, I don't know that we've thought about climate finance as part of the solution to this challenge, but you think about this all the time. I don't know if you have any advice for this community on how to think about that going forward.
Thank you, Tori. Of course, climate finance could definitely be an additional source of finance to many of these efforts. Of course, climate finance will hinge on the level of emission reductions that you can actually realize through investments in renewable energy. So that means we also need to get the data correct. At the same time, we also need to be mindful of the fact that it's quite complicated procedures to access climate finance also. So maybe I would my recommendation would be to target sort of SDGs, what I would label as SDG 7 finance, and then complement this with some climate finance. But of course, the accredited entity to the various climate finance instruments that we have established, for instance, the Green Climate Fund, we have the UNDP and the UN system at large, and including the World Bank, can definitely try to put together a larger operation, maybe covering several countries where this can be promoted or put to the table of climate finance actors, and then we'll see what the response will be. And I think definitely there is a need for all of us, and this is an issue that the UAE will focus on at COP28, and that is the level of climate finance flowing to fragile countries. So I think this could be actually a vehicle or instrument to increase climate finance to fragile countries. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good point. And if our UAE colleague wants to jump in, I welcome that. And whether this is a topic for the COP, while she's considering that, I will note we do have a question here. Someone represents the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance in the United States. And the author writes that private sector members are very interested in expanding their power purchase agreement portfolios, but may be new to working in these environments. Is there a way to better connect these broad industry interests to the work that the UN missions are doing in country with the governments and hopefully the private sector? Complicated but important question. I don't know if we have anyone who would like to take that one on. Okay. Maybe we could expand the conversation a bit. I don't know if our colleague from DOS is still with us, but I see Rutu. Why don't we turn to you next?
So I think certainly, like, as I mentioned in my kind of brief intervention, there should be a role for the private sector. This cannot wholly and solely be on the shoulders for the public sector. But what we do find in places that are difficult to access, that it's difficult for the private sector to kind of come in without like a guarantee in place from financial institutions, or with there is more stability in the local government. So I think we would be happy to engage with actors that are private sector actors that are interested in providing energy resources in hard to reach areas, but also kind of keeping in mind that often financial guarantees are required for them to make their initiatives sustainable and for them to take the risk, which is often great in a lot of cases. So I think that's one of the hurdles that we do see for private sector engagement, but always happy to have the private sector involved in this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful to know. I'm wondering too, this is a very ambitious effort to have not just the UN mission shift from heavy reliance on diesel for its own purposes and its own success, but at the same time to try and make this a positive legacy where it can coordinate such that the assets for the energy are available more broadly. So I don't want to put my DOS colleagues on the spot, but I know they're thinking about this with the compact. I would love to turn next to both Elizabeth, and I also believe we have Joe Harvey with us. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Joe, who leads our environment section, to further elucidate on this. But you asked, is there a phase 3 for the environment strategy? Because that's our 2-phase strategy is formally coming to a close, and the second part has focused on renewable energy and positive legacy. So I think we are, we're in the context, in the midst of consulting member states on what they want to see, and we're getting very positive indications that they want to see more of where we are headed in phase 2 of the strategy. So I'll let Joanna come in on that, but we've been really heartened actually by the support that we've had from member states for this direction. Eugene's reply on the budget was terrific, exhaustive. Anytime anybody can say administrative committee and it, I can't even actually repeat it so trippingly. I'm always impressed. But you heard DRSG Song mentioning that the one-year budget is obviously a challenge for us, but I don't think it's a showstopper. Because even though we had yearly budgets, of course, we know that many of our missions have a fairly long environmental, fairly long horizon, and we can work with that. I think that doesn't prevent us from becoming an anchor for power purchase agreements, as we've seen where this is starting to work. But we'd really obviously be very interested in continuing the conversation with the World Bank also on how to better coordinate the incredibly different time horizons. Challenging, but not impossible. And if I may, I'd like to turn over to Joe.
Yes, we welcome Joe jumping in here. Joe Harvey from the department, from DOS.
Thanks. Thanks, Tori. Thanks, Elizabeth. And hi to everyone. Really a great discussion. So it's such a great report and really interesting to hear all the perspectives on it. A few things on the sort of next phase of the environment strategy. We've been working with some of our closest member states and the group of friends on their priorities going forward. And excuse me. Renewable energy continues to be a really high priority for member states, and I think Hans-Olaf mentioned that that there's Security Council mandates increasingly around this as well. So, for all the things that we will be focusing on environmental management and peacekeeping operations, we will be focusing on renewable energy for sure. On the question of budgets, I agree with Elizabeth's comment that. That Eugene gave a very comprehensive perspective on the UN sort of one-year budget cycle, one-year mandate renewal cycle. I do think there's another aspect to this as well, coming back to Ruta's point around, how we line up with actors that are thinking in different terms. So you're thinking, and I think this comes back also to Hans-Olaf's point about climate financing. How do we link up our sort of often quite sort of near-term perspectives with the longer-term perspective, and that's something we're really trying to think through and understand. So with the World Bank, for example, there's a sort of multi-year process that goes into designing the kind of project that Ruta was mentioning that's being put to the board later this month. And in a way, we're lucky with the timing that where it's sort of talking at the right moment, and probably, hopefully we'll be able to link up well in relation to the various things that are coming together in South Sudan. But in other areas, I think there's a sort of parallel conversation that we need to have with the bank and other development partners, and probably around climate finance as well, around the longer term, and how do we make sure that we're linked into longer term policy discussions that aren't necessarily linked into the specifics of certain countries, but that sort of, that these actors do see peacekeeping as a relevant thing to take into consideration when they're designing longer term interventions, because the scale of peacekeeping is such that it really can be very relevant. In some places, we can account for as much as 40% of the footprint in some of the countries where we're located. So I know we've talked about this, many of the actors that are speaking on the panel, we've spoken about this before, but I do think that that's something that is really important to make sure that we're having the right kinds of conversations at the policy level with longer term actors in these contexts. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Tori.
We'll let you go, Joe, but will that be the next phase of the environment strategy, where those transition ambitions working with other partners is laid out? Not to put you on the spot, but maybe a little.
Yeah, I mean, for sure it will be set out as a priority. We may not have all of the answers, but part of the strategy will be trying to work out some of those answers. So yeah, it's definitely a feature in there. I wish I could, like give you something, more detail, but but it's in there for sure, along with other ongoing priorities such as risk. You know, one of the, coming back to Hans-Olof, is an increasing focus on this language around positive legacy, and seeing how the 6 or 7 billion a year that's spent on peacekeeping can be spent in a way that leaves something useful behind after peacekeeping operations with a relatively short-term time horizon leave. So there's a lot of thinking to be done and a lot of good practice to be sought out and understood and developed to see how to make that happen. But I think that the next phase of the environment strategy will be very much about that. So thanks. Thank you, Tori.
Well, thank you so much. And so I am noting the time, and we promised our participants that we would try and wrap up by 12:15. So I think Jo Harvey from DOS and her colleague Elizabeth have left us in a situation where we're forward looking. And so while this report does talk about the challenge for South Sudan, where we've been corrected, it's not 7.2, but perhaps 1% or less who have access to energy. And that is important for us to keep in mind. We've also heard about the immense progress that's moved forward with the Energy Compact, with the ambitions of the government of South Sudan aligning with the ambitions of UNMISS to both meet its mandate, but to think more broadly about the transition, a positive legacy, and the many options for bringing energy to the mission itself, but potentially to work with the communities for that. I at least heard some very concrete things in addition to the compact being announced and additional projects being added to that. The ambition to think about financing those projects and looking towards the next COP meeting is maybe a way to have a conversation across the rest of this year. Many of us know there's also other high-level events coming up, including high-level political forum and work around the SDGs, the high-level week this fall, and even a peacekeeping summit that I think is being hosted in Ghana. All of these are potential platforms. And I want to thank the authors of the report, particularly Flora Eugene with Dave's guidance to really make a case for how this challenge is also wound into the political and conflict economies of countries, and particularly South Sudan, and what we should be mindful of in trying to address this, but a very also optimistic view of the different things and the clear opportunities for working with the private sector, with policymakers, with the bank, finance, and those who have ambitions to develop energy access there. So I want to leave on a positive note, even though we do feel some urgency to move forward from the ideas here to the practical movement to provide greater change. But none of this would happen without our great colleagues. To the Norwegian embassy in New York and beyond, and at home, also to the UAE, across continents, just thank you for being thought partners and leaders on this. Thank you to the United Nations, which has really run with a set of ideas, both in the field and in headquarters, and to the research team and my colleagues at Powering Peace, who are really trying to analyze, document, and be clear-eyed about what it might take to make this transition, but also reminding us what the benefits will be if it works well, which is what our goal is. I think there's information on websites if people want to follow up on any of the reports, the upcoming meetings, and Jo Harvey's next phase of the environment strategy. So I think with that, we'll bring it to a close, and I look forward to the next conversation and keeping in touch with everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today.